That's
My name is Kim Haig, and I'm the president of Wild Ones of Northern King County for this year. And I'm so glad you're all coming. We really appreciate our collaboration with the Gail Borden Library, who's helping us bring all of these programs to you. And as Sadia said, you can go to startinyouryard.com and see the other programs that are coming up. So please do that. I also, although you're certainly welcome to come to all of our programs, as not as members, I really encourage you to be a part of us and join and become a member. You just go to wildones.org and join that way. And it's an inexpensive $40 a year. So I'd really love to have you join us. We have a lot of programs coming up. Luann's going to talk about those. And I'm going to turn it over to Mary Alice right now, who's our plant sale coordinator. Mary Alice.
Mary Alice, we don't hear you now. No.
Unmute.
I can talk about the plant sale. Can you hear me? I'll just start until Mary Alice jumps in. We're having still it's a COVID related plant sale this year. We're going to have, at the moment, we're offering a pre-sale, and that's just for members only. And if you want to email me, kjhaig@comcast.net, I'd be glad to send you the plant list. You'd need to actually be a member in order to participate in our pre-sale, but we'd be happy to have you do that. So on the screen, it says that we're having native trees and shrub pickup on May 7th. The Midwest ground covers pickup is on May 14th. And then we're having, did I get that wrong? And Possibility Place. And then on May 21st, we're having a semi-public sale, which is going to be a ticketed sale just to keep the numbers in order. So, and that's going to be from Taylor Creek Restoration Nursery, and then anything we have left over for their other plant sales. So I said, you're welcome. We will be sending out more information about the May 21st sale later. The other thing we're going to offer through the Conservation Foundation, we're going to offer the possibility of buying rain barrels. So we will be giving more information about that a little later on. So I do encourage you to join. Feel free to email me, as I said, kjhaag@comcast.net, and I would be glad to send you the plants that we're having for sale. Thank you. Luann?
Hi, everybody. Just a little bit of a review. I just saw a comment from Josh. Josh will be repeating that email again in a couple of minutes. Just a little recap. I'd just like to talk about Start in Your Yard for a minute. Start in Your Yard is a community initiative that Wild Ones launched last year to popularize and further the ideas and goals that were set by Doug Ptolemy, etymologist, author, biologist, and so many other things. He encourages us all to start in our own yards to help create a connected, homegrown national park across the nation and, gee, everywhere. Then I want to talk to you a little bit about our community read. I hope you're participating. Thanks to our partnership with the Gail Borden Library, they suggested a community read and discussions of Doug Ptolemy's latest book, Nature's Best Hope, for Elgin and for beyond. They encouraged us to invite experts from across the community to share their expertise, to get folks on whatever path that they could manage toward that goal. Again, we'd like to talk to you about Gail Borden Library. They're hosting this program and discussion. Their enthusiasm and creativity for Start in Your Yard helped launch the program, and they're giving it the reach and boost it needed in this community. We've got some upcoming programs for Wild Ones we want you to know about. Here they are. We've also, that they're up through May, but we've also just finalized a program for June that you're going to be interested in. And we have 2 wonderful garden tours in areas that we've yet to explore. Next, you're going to be receiving a certificate of participation. I believe it's going to come at the end of this Zoom. Please watch for it. It's going to allow you to redeem at our plant sale. Please remember what Sadia said as we start the program. Put questions in the Q&A and comments in the chat. Now, it's my great privilege. We're delighted to have Rory Klick as a presenter tonight. She's in her 13th year as a member of the faculty at the College of Lake County. She's department chair of their horticultural program, and she received the college's Teaching Excellence Award previously. Boy, oh boy, she's been boots on the ground for 40 years in nursery production, landscape design and building, natural area restoration, and community greening. She's worked with lots of important people and places, the city of Chicago, the Chicago Botanic Garden, and we just found out she also worked with Fermilab. Wow. She holds degrees in horticulture, landscape architecture, and plant ecology. When we asked her for a bio, she said it was okay to say that she's an overeducated gardener, but we will not. Rory lives simply with her family and animals on a small farm in southern Wisconsin. Let's see what Rory has to say about growing native plant communities. Welcome, Rory.
Thank you so much. So I love speaking to Wild Ones chapters in particular because I met Lori Otto as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison when I was very young, and had the great delight of being invited to her yard that got her in so much trouble, that started all of this. And she was just such a very sweet, kind person, and so welcoming to the restoration ecology students from Madison. Just a delight. And that has been my experience with plant people in general, right? I even married one. My husband is a botanist and the senior restoration ecologist for our local forest preserve district in Lake County, Illinois. And we have had the great pleasure of mumbling to each other in Latin binomials for now over 35 years. So, you know, I think there's something to that. But I feel honored to speak to you because I am preaching to the choir a little bit. One of the things that I do a good deal in my speaking work is to speak with industry professionals and garden clubs that don't always know the benefits of native plants. And so in that sense, I feel I'm already speaking to a receptive crowd. I will say I prepared not just a presentation, but a handout summary, and I know I shared that with Nancy prior to the program, and she's able to share it with you. And I tried to form a very succinct synopsis of the key points and as well as the plant species list that we cover. So if you don't keep up with things via notes, please know that that will be shared with you. So without further ado, because I always try and fit just a little too much in, ask my students, I guess I want to speak to you tonight about the approach of right plant, right place within the larger context of plant communities. So we're going to talk about what that means. And first I want to, you know, just make sure we're all on the same page by saying we definitely need a new paradigm for our residential landscape approach. You have all driven by these landscapes, right? This is held up as kind of the standard, this is what we should have for the suburban landscape. And I will tell you, as a plant ecologist, there is almost, you know, no place more sterile until we get into a big ag monoculture field. But there's very minimal diversity here. There's very minimal habitat. There's very minimal function provided by these plants. Almost all of them are non-native. And it's, you know, I feel like we've kind of been sold a bill of goods that this is what we should have. And I think, you know, being the person who likes to cause good trouble, my response is, who says so? Because I would like to see a landscape paradigm where diversity matters, where habitat is a critical priority, and where we realize that plants play a critical functional role in our ecosystem, even if that ecosystem is just our backyard or our front yard. I love to set the tone with this quote from E.O. Wilson, that on a global basis, the biggest threats to our biodiversity are habitat loss and invasive species. And that really just kind of sums up what has dominated a huge portion of my career, is trying to compensate for these two issues. So let's look at factor number one, habitat loss. Some of you may be familiar with this historic map on the right that shows the state of Illinois, and everything that you see in yellow was essentially tall grass prairie. And today, the statistic given is that less than 1/10 of 1% remains. The parts that remain are often very small, isolated little remnants, fragmented. And so Prairie Restoration, which really started kind of in the 1950s with Curtis and Green in the Madison, Wisconsin region. And then, you know, there was the landmark work done in the early 70s, really on through, I would say, the 90s, out at Fermilab, establishing many acres. And quite a few dozen of those I got to help plant as an intern. But that's really the only way that most people will be able to truly see prairie. Even the reserves that we have, you know, the Joliet Arsenal facility and at Medewin, and the Nachusa Preserve out near, I forget what the town is out there. But even those places, while there was remnant ecosystem, a lot has been done through restoration, the physical act of trying to put back that community, because we've so lost it. And our urban green spaces need to play a more significant role in that. So that promotion that you have, Start in Your Yard, to put action behind Doug Tallamy's message, is really critical, because so much of our land area is really in private residential landscape. I think I've seen statistics as much as 63 or 64% of Lake County, where I teach, is land cover that's owned by homeowners, right? So how do we change what that looks like? Well, first, we need to consider that factor number two, the invasive species. And some of you may recognize buckthorn, which is my most hated invasive species. I'm going to be very candid. And garlic mustard, that's also up there in the top 5 for me. And, you know, I've spent countless hours of my personal and professional career controlling some of these. We have to know what it is that does damage to our ecosystem, and we have to learn to identify those key things, and also learn how best to control them. And one of the big pushes that I am working on in my professional outreach is talking to the green industry, the landscapers and the nurseries that produce these materials, that we have an ethical obligation as green professionals to stop propagating things that are known as invasives. This is burning bush, Euonymus elatus. This is Bradford pear, Pyrus calariana. And both of these are still widely propagated and sold in the nursery industry and the landscape industry, even though we have decades of documentation of of these plants taking over our woodlands, taking over everything that you see on this hillside in white is Bradford pear. Everything that you see in this woodland that is scarlet is burning bush. And those really have to be changes from within that we're willing to make as an industry. We also have to understand that biodiversity has value simply for biodiversity. The variety of plants and animals and living organisms in a region has value just because it is. And you know, it can have some slightly different nuances. We can talk about the number of species, we can talk about the abundance of species, but that beautiful map of the state of Illinois that showed so much of our state in yellow, prairie is incredibly diverse as an ecosystem. We think of the tropical rainforests as having the greatest diversity, but a good cubic or a good square meter of native prairie, indigenous high quality prairie, could surpass the biodiversity of a tropical rainforest. Now, compromised ecosystems lose that biodiversity. So when they're degraded, when they're no longer functional or managed well, sorry about that. And there's nobody home to answer the phone for me. So I'm just going to keep talking. When systems become degraded, then we start to lose that biodiversity. And the species that disappear first are the species that are most sensitive to degradation. We call those the conservative species or the high C-value species. And those are the things that we start to lose first. So I want to put forward that very much like Mr. Tallamy, Dr. Tallamy, I suppose, I'm going to promote a philosophy and approach that considers the larger ecosystem, considers the relationships that certain plants have with each other and with the land. So I want to talk for just a moment about ecological function. As someone trained in restoration ecology, I was trained that we have a purpose for why we're doing that work, why we're doing that restoration. It might be aesthetic, it might be functional in that we want to provide habitat, or we want to purify water or prevent erosion, but there's a functional role that plants play in the landscape. And so too often we think of our backyards solely for how they look and not for how they function. And so part of this paradigm shift is getting you to kind of step back and think, what purpose are these plants serving? What role in the landscape are they providing? Are they helping water infiltrate and percolate into the ground more effectively? Are they providing pollinator habitat? Are they mitigating runoff that would otherwise just run off my property and into the storm sewer system? Are they helping improve the soil fertility and aggregate structure? And all of these things are things that can be achieved by sensitive plantings in our landscape, but not always achieved by the traditional ornamental horticulture landscape. So I've mentioned that I studied restoration ecology, and I will tell you in the early 1980s, this was a brand new thing, the Society of Ecologic Restoration, and a bunch of us students got together out in Berkeley, California for our first conference, and we were so excited. We were going to implement restoration and save the planet. And now many years later, I'm a little more cynical than I was back then, but I still feel that this is one of the most necessary professions. And yet when I go and speak to junior high and high school groups about their career opportunities related to plant science, this is an area they have never heard of. And I want to kind of get out there and spread the word about how we need restoration professionals who go about that activity of trying to help an ecosystem recover. Now, we might not be able to put every single piece and part that is missing back into place, but we certainly can work to restore the health and the function of that ecosystem that used to be there. So I guess then, boiling it down to our scale for this evening is, can backyards and gardens be considered ecologic restoration sites? I think to some degree they can, but I think the marvelous thing about working at a backyard scale is that you don't need to be a purist, right? I'm not asking you to commit to 100% of your garden being native or being entirely around an ecosystem principle, right? I live on about 7 acres, most of it oak woodland. And, I have ornamental things around my house that are not native. I have a lot of natives though. And, I certainly still want to grow my tomatoes and my pumpkins and my peppers and things like that. So this is not an all or nothing endeavor. This is a how much can I do as a homeowner kind of endeavor. And how much can I include biodiversity. And I think, again, I want to just really emphasize that it boils down to moving beyond how things look and thinking about how things work, right? And I am a big believer that beauty happens when things are functional and healthy. And when you put these native plants in, you can put them in whatever arrangement you find visually pleasing. But the fact that you've done this design specifically with natives immediately changes the functionality and the role that this landscape has in providing habitat. So we're going to look at things from the community perspective. And an ecosystem or plant community is a collection of plant species that live together in a certain range and have comparable habitat needs. So light, full sun, or shade, or partial, soil requirements, soil moisture requirements. Are we talking about hydric things that like saturated soils, or xeric things that like dry, well-drained soils? Those ecosystems have plant assemblages, right? A whole mix of things that is adapted to that specific set of environmental conditions. And if you take that and apply it to your landscape, you have this ready-made mix of things that are appropriate for your site. So let's look at what those 4 major ecosystems, and I'm going to tell you now, it just depends on how absolutely detailed we want to be. If you were to read the Chicago Wilderness Atlas for Biodiversity, I think they've defined 27 Chicago Wilderness Region ecosystems and community assemblages. We're going to simplify that a little bit. So I'm going to talk about woodlands, right? Where you have essentially a canopy that has in the range of 50 to 80% canopy closure, right? So that's kind of the parameter that we use. I'm going to talk about savannas, which tend to be in that 10 to 50% kind of open grown kind of shade and canopy closure. We're going to talk about prairies that tend to be less than 10%, so almost no trees at all. And then I'm going to acknowledge wetlands, but I'm going to tell you very candidly, if you want a wetland and aquatic and rain garden program, we have to do that on another day because I can't fit it all in. But these are kind of the 4 major ecosystems that we define for our region. Now let's talk about what each of those looks like. A healthy northern Illinois woodland should be open at the human scale, meaning you should be able to see through that woodland. There should be canopy closure, again, in that kind of 50 to 80% range above you. But at that human level, you visually should be able to look right through that woodland. And too often, our concept of a woodland is this dense thicket of brush and small trees at the human scale. That's all material that should not be there. I would be willing to wager that most of that is buckthorn. And another significant portion of it is amur or Tutarian honeysuckle, multiflora rose, and Japanese barberry, and maybe a little burning bush thrown in there. It's the woody invasive plants that have taken up this zone in the middle at the human scale and filled it in and changed the dynamic. But a healthy woodland should have light penetration, particularly in the early spring before the leaves have fully emerged. And that is the sunlight that is necessary for those beautiful spring woodland wildflowers that we all love to see. And many of those spring wildflowers go dormant once the canopy has fully leafed on. They're ephemeral, there for a short time. But these woods with an oak canopy dominant and maybe some scattered hickory and a few other things, they need light penetration, and they also need to burn periodically. They burn less frequently than prairies or wetlands, and they burn less hot. But fire is still an integral part of maintaining this community. Then there's savannas, where you have these wide open grown trees. And I want to point out the branching structure on these trees, that you see that broad horizontal branching structure. Even 100 years later, you can look at the structure of that tree and you can know, did this grow in a woodland or did it grow in a savanna, by whether or not those horizontal branches are there. This plant grew up not having to compete for light with its neighbors, so it could spread out. And if we go back for a second and look at those woodland trees, they tend to be much more upright and not branch until much further up. And those branches tend to reach more upward. And that's because they grew in proximity, close proximity to their neighbors, and they had some competition for that light. So they wanted to get tall and get up to the light sooner. So a definite difference there. And you have a different composition of those ground layer species, those things that are on the ground underneath the trees. And here we will start to see the woodland things that can tolerate more sun, and the prairie things that will tolerate more shade, but then also a number of unique to the savanna species. And so savanna was not as well understood as some of the other major ecosystems until fairly recently, within the last couple decades. And then we have the prairie, our grassland prairie, and there's lots of different kinds of prairie, right? We have short grass prairie, mixed grass prairie, the palisade prairie, the tall grass that we're all familiar with. We have gravel prairies on hilltops and calcareous prairies, and all of those different nuances have different plant compositions, different mixes of specific species. And so if you know that you have a full sun site and you'd like to grow some prairie things, then the next question is, and what is the soil like? And what is the drainage like? Because let's make sure that we pick the right mix of prairie things from the right kind of prairie. And again, if you like the look of letting things truly naturalize, that's wonderful. But a lot of these can be used as beautiful ornamental perennials in a more structured perennial garden or border, and look wonderful, more structured, more intentional, but yet still give you the balance and the benefit of that biodiversity and that habitat provision. And then there's wetlands, and wetlands are so vastly underrated. I think we have a greater appreciation for them now, but historically these were places that were drained or filled because they were just considered wasteland for breeding mosquitoes. Now we understand that those are the great sponges of our region, and wetlands act like a giant sponge to soak up surplus moisture so it doesn't become a flood problem downstream, and then slowly release that. Again, one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems that we have, and so important for our water quality and our stormwater storage. I spent a good chunk of my career working on wetland creation and wetland mitigation projects. And I think they're beautiful places. And that, again, is not always something that's appreciated. So we can revisit the issue of wetlands again in the future. So again, what are the implications for boiling this down to the backyard scale? I want you to think of these ecosystems as kind of ready-made planting pallets. I love that notion. So that if you can identify your light, your soil, and your hydrology, which is the moisture level that you have on your property, you can kind of pick that ready-made mix of plant materials that's already evolved to work together in those conditions, and you can know exactly what will be suited to your site. While there's always some maintenance to get things established, because these plants are evolutionarily adapted to working together and working with each other, there really isn't a whole lot of maintenance once you have your plants established. So I want to show this picture and try and explain it as I explain it to my students. So one axis of this is hydrology. You have your wet or hydric, you have your mesic, and you have your dry. And another axis is up here along the top, and that's full sun, partial sun, all the way over to full shade, right? So think about this as a quilt or a mosaic of the landscape of the Midwest. And here you have prairie that's dry, and here you have prairie that's mesic, and here you have prairie that's wet. And that grades into savanna, right? And that grades into woodland. And so when we think of prairie, savanna, and woodland, they can be anything from dry to wet, but they're really defined by their level of shade or canopy closure, or in the case of prairie, their absence of a canopy, right? Now, wetlands are defined on the other axis. Wetlands may be open with no trees, or have some scattered trees, or we can have forested wetlands, which are typically referred to as swamps. So wetlands are defined on a different axis. But our original landscape for the region, historically prior to white European settlement, had this really vast mosaic, and one graded into the next and graded into the next. And that was part of the system. But what I want to say is that for our region, all of these are fire integrated, fire dependent communities. So they all burned periodically. So you start by doing good site analysis. This is my landscape architecture side coming out. You need to know what you have. And I put this picture in here of the person standing out in the field with their umbrella and their raincoat, because truly, how many of you have stood in your garden when it's raining and watched where the water goes? That's one of the most wonderful things you can do, is to really get a sense of where that water moves and where it gathers, and what your topography is that affects your drainage. And then spend some time looking at how light moves through your property. Where does it hit in the morning versus the afternoon, the heat of the day? Is it full light, or is it dappled light? Is it dense shade created by dense canopies or buildings versus high open shade? All of those things make a difference in the nuances of matching your site to your planting palette. So I want to go through briefly kind of the lessons that I think apply from the discipline of restoration ecology, and kind of distill those down to the residential landscape scale. So first, set a goal for your native garden, whether it's functional and it's a job you need it to do, or if it's just aesthetic or a combination. What is it that you want your garden to do? This garden is in a swale, right? And it's a rain garden. It has some natives, it has some non-natives, but part of the role of this garden is to soak up that surplus water that would otherwise just kind of settle into the ditch. That's a functional role we're asking the landscape to play. Think about all the different functional roles that plants do play for us. My oldest son is a municipal forester. He's working on a plan for his municipality so that all the trees that they replace, all the parkway trees that they work to replace, have been chosen so that they maximize carbon sequestration. What a concept that we're asking our street trees to help filter pollution, take carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere, as well as provide shade and cooling. So again, looking to have plants fill these marvelous roles. Soil formation is a big one. We do a lot of cover cropping at our campus farm, and although we tilled the first couple years, 2010 and 2012, I want to say that our farm beds have not been tilled since 2014. And we use no-till methods, we use cover crops, we use broad forks, and we have the most amazing soil. And we use a lot of, we make a lot of compost and we use a lot of compost. So all these different things. And then again, just the whole range of things that wetlands can do and provide. If any of you have visited the wetland demonstration project along the Des Plaines River in Lake County, that is a place where wetlands were actually recreated along the Des Plaines River so that they could provide stormwater storage like they used to do before we channelized the river, right? So another lesson from ecologic restoration is that not all natives are good, right? So we have to be more nuanced in our understanding than non-native is bad and native is good. That's really not the case. Probably 85% plus is the statistic that I have heard of non-natives live peacefully and coexist just fine and create no problem. It's a relatively minor proportion of non-natives that do not mind their manners and have invasive, aggressive reproduction tendencies and become a problem. And conversely, not all natives are good. This is old-field goldenrod, Solidago altissima. None of you are allowed to plant that. That's not a Solidago you want to encourage. There is something that has happened at the genetic level of that plant in the last 15 to 20 years that has changed its behavior, and it's now aggressive, and we actually have to control it out of our restorations. This is a photograph of box elder, Acer negundo. It's a perfectly native tree. It's incredibly invasive, right? So make those distinctions, get down to the nuances beyond native and non-native. Another lesson I've learned as both a restorationist and a gardener myself is that more conservative plants, plants that need a higher quality habitat in nature and consequently have a higher C value, if any of you are familiar with plants of the Chicago region or flora of the Chicago region, there's a standardized system where every species listed in that book has a C value from 1 to 10. And the higher the number, the more conservative that plant is, meaning the higher quality native habitat it needs to thrive. And those higher C value plants are often the ones that disappear first when a natural system is degraded or chopped up or polluted or filled or whatever we do to those native systems, right? In gardening, that matters less. When I was doing restoration as a professional, sometimes we had a very, very difficult time getting more conservative plants to kind of come back into the restoration because we were doing them, 10 or 40 or 100 acres at a time. When you're working at a backyard scale, you can find just the right niche, and you can even introduce some of the right mycorrhiza if necessary. And sometimes that's what it takes. But you can give them that extra little bit of nurturing that they need to thrive. And you can have some of those conservative species like gentians and shooting star and ladies' tresses orchids, which, by the way, do much better when you have a little mycorrhizal inoculation. So mycorrhiza are beneficial fungal associates in the soil. And years ago, when I was an undergrad in horticulture, it was not at all a common thing to inoculate plants with mycorrhiza. Now we actually buy our potting media pre-inoculated with mycorrhizal associations because it's beneficial to the roots of many plants. Another lesson is to understand succession, which is the progressive transition that ecosystems go through over time, and to understand plant behavior. So one of the things we've learned about prairie restoration is that in the early days of restoration, we used to put a lot of big blue stem or Indian grass out onto the ground, sometimes as much as 10 or even 20 pounds an acre. And basically what we would have over time is a blue stem monoculture with very low diversity and very few forbs, because that grass just became so dominant that we couldn't shift the balance back. So now we've learned to maybe put half a pound an acre in, if any, right? Sometimes I don't put any tall grasses in because I want to be mindful that shorter grasses like prairie dropseed will be more effective in a residential scale. And I'm going to talk to you about some specific grasses that I recommend when we get to the plant section. You also have to understand that certain plants that are kind of what we call matrix species or pioneer species will establish first, and then over time will kind of pull back and not be as dominant. And those kinds of ebb and flow relationships among the plants are very natural. Another lesson is to know species interactions and make sure that those interactions can work for you. This is something called betony, and it's actually a hemiparasite plant, and it needs certain mycorrhiza in the soil, and it needs certain adjacent roots to it that it can kind of parasitize, not in a bad way, but just in a way that if you want to grow this plant and have it be happy and have it increase and expand and thrive, you need to understand it lives in association with certain other plants. You also need to understand the root systems. Tap-rooted plants like many of the silphiums, if you've worked with compass plant or prairie dock or some of the silphiums, those have tap roots. Same thing with Baptisias. The cream wild and white wild indigos, they have tap roots, and so you can't transplant them. You have to put them where you want them and leave them alone. But you can plant other things around them quite closely versus a fibrous root system where you really can't get in there. So understanding kind of the dynamics and the needs of the plants is important. This is a tough one for gardeners because we'd like to think that we can improve the soil, and we can, right? We're so often used to gardening and adding compost, adding good organic matter back to the soil. That's the best thing that we can do for it. But when you are establishing native plants, if you amend or fertilize, what you tend to do is give a competitive advantage to the weeds who like that higher nitrogen level, higher phosphorus level, versus the native plants that really prefer not to have that. So I'm going to tell you, don't amend. If your soil is crappy, select a palette of matrix things that appreciate that crappy soil. Crappy is a technical term in my classes, by the way. So another lesson is that seed is cheaper, no doubt about it. Plugs are faster, however, but the cost adds up quickly. And so I'm delighted to hear about your plant sale. I'll have to make sure I'm a member so that I can come because I'm always looking for good sources for native plants. And we have a plant sale at the college as well. So we'll try and share information, and it's going to be an online order and curbside pickup scheduled slots kind of thing. So much like you're doing to make it safer. But let's face it, we all want to find good sources for these plants. And whatever you do, I see people do this all the time. I've worked at a lot of native plant sales as a volunteer over the years. I was a nursery manager for many years. They buy one or two or maybe three of something. No, buy a dozen. Really, trust me. If you think you need 500 square feet of seed, buy for 1,000. it really does pay to work in bulk. My husband and I, just this winter, we timbered out some of the walnuts on our property. Not that black walnut is not native, it is, but in an oak woodland, that walnut came to be because the area was grazed and the grazing animals avoided the seedlings of walnut. And so they grew up and they took hold, and then they created a zone of allelopathic exudate, they exude the juglone from their root systems, and it kind of eliminated the competition. And then when they got big enough, their shade is so much denser that they shaded out the oak regeneration. So we harvested the walnuts out, and now we're looking at the property and thinking, yeah, we need to reevaluate our seed order for this year. It's going to be a lot more than we thought. Seed has to take sometimes not just a year, but sometimes 2 or 3. And people will often seed and say, oh, I didn't see things germinate. This isn't like your packet of seeds that you put in your garden. They will wait until conditions are right. They might have to be stratified for a second season, or maybe the company didn't stratify them. So give them time and be patient. You may see things after year 2 or after year 3 that were originally seeded, and you thought that they had not come, but they will be there. Another lesson is that when you are purchasing local counts, there are different genotypes, genetic profiles of plants by geographic region. And so generally we really like for ecologic restorations to try and find seed within 50 or 100 miles of the site that we're restoring. I think that's very challenging. I think a lot of the really good nurseries are up in Wisconsin. I'm trying to think. I also buy from Prairie Moon, which is in southeastern Minnesota, actually. And I buy from Genesis Nursery, which is out in Tampico, Illinois. So that's about my radius when I'm doing, stuff in my backyard. I don't want to go really too far beyond the Midwest. Because those local genotypes and working with true native species that are not a cultivar, because a lot of cultivars have been developed from some of our natives, will improve the habitat value that you have. We've done some comparison monitoring of pollinator visits on Monarda didyma, the cultivated garden bee balm, versus Monarda fistulosa, and that native Monarda fistulosa wins the pollinator diversity competition hands down. Over 40 different kinds of bees and lepidopterans and things visited our native Monarda. So another lesson is that not all weeds are equally bad. Some are not bad at all. I don't even kind of bother with them. Things like chicory and on this depends on the scale of the restoration, right? If I'm not going to hand weed acres and acres. Even Queen Anne's lace, while it's annoying, over time, over the first 4 to 8 years of the restoration, once the natives really start to take hold and we're able to get a burn in there, it will not persist. So if I take a long enough time frame, there's a lot of weeds that I know just won't be able to last. On the other hand, there's some that are horrible. Things like purple loosestrife, either of the sweet clovers, the white sweet clover, Mellilotus alba, and the yellow sweet clover, Mellilotus officinalis, are horrible. And when I see those, I want to get in and I want to get them. If I can't pull them, because sometimes you can't, I want to cut them off as low as possible and make sure that they do not set seed, right? Same thing with the loosestrife. This is one of the rare cases where I might concede to use a little herbicide. Another lesson is that if you're going to battle for claiming ground and you're battling the weeds, use what we call sedge warriors. Sedges are in the genus Carex. There's probably about 300 and some different species of Carex. Everything from growing in water to growing on a mountaintop, growing in full sun to growing in dense shade. There is a sedge for that specific habitat that you are working with. Find out your sedges that are part of the ecosystem you're working with and work to get those sedges established. They are warriors in colonizing the ground and making it more hospitable for other natives and less hospitable for weeds. So fire and herbicides are tools in your toolkit. They are necessary tools, and it's important that you know how to use your tools. This is one of my preferred methods when I do have to break down and use an herbicide, and I don't do that very often. But when I do not like to spray, because with the application in a spray form, you have the risk of drift and damage to other things. If you do a wick application where you're painting on that herbicide in a very, very focused way, you don't have the issue of drift onto adjacent plants. You have a much lower level of residual, right, in the region because you've just targeted it on. Now this is one that we've made. There's a squeeze bottle up here just beyond the view where the person's hand is, and this is a tube, and this is a sponge at the bottom, and we can literally just go along and kind of dab this. I also like to use, you know, those little dish soap sponges where the handle is hollow and you can put your dish soap in them. Put a little herbicide in there and just go around with your little sponge and dab on the things that you need to. Foam paint brushes. When I'm working with some ecosystems, I will even put on a double heavy rubber glove and a terry cloth glove over it. And I'll dip my fingers into the herbicide and then just be able to kind of paint the target plant with my hands and not have drift onto anything else. And then I manage the prescribed burns at our campus. My husband and I have been managing burns for many, many years. We're both federally certified. And I know a lot of homeowners get nervous about that. You can ask for permission to do a small prescribed burn on your property through the Illinois EPA. You do need to follow some rules and regulations and notify your local fire department. But my husband and I do this every year, and it is worth it. We don't burn the same places on our property every year, but we try and burn some portion of the property each year. And then there's also small flame weeders, and this you do not need a permit for. You can just come in and kind of target burn a small little zone, and you can have it in and out and done in 15 or 20 minutes before your neighbors have even noticed. And that is an issue with your neighbors, right? So I remember the first time when I was newly married and we moved into a little home, and it was just a rental house, but I was, I had more energy than money. And so I offered to do all the gardening and the lawn care in exchange for a discount on the rent. And the landlord quickly accepted that. And I asked if I could create some garden beds, and she said, oh, sure. And I quickly pulled out the front lawn and put in lots of beautiful plants. And the neighbors were quite concerned about this. They were really kind of up in arms that I would get rid of the lawn and put in all kinds of different plants. And but I kept it weeded, and I kept it looking nice. And I was a regular presence, and I was very friendly. I would always wave and say hello. And I would talk to the children in the neighborhood. I would let the children come and play in the yard. And I knew I had won the cranky old lady across the street over when one day she was walking along the sidewalk, and I saw her reach down and run her hands through a particularly soft plant. And I said, I've got you, right? So do be respectful. If your neighbors need a little buffer of turf, or they need to see a clearly delineated bed to understand that this isn't just wild, then understand that that's your comfort, their comfort level, right? And you can be respectful of that, but also know your rights. Understand the landscape ordinance for your municipality and any additional rules and regulations of your homeowners association, and know what you can and cannot do and what you can ask variance to do. I had to get a variance on a number of properties when I wanted to plant grasses that were taller than 8 inches in the front yard. Fine. I did a request for variance. I held a public meeting. I answered the questions. I submitted my planting plan, and the Planning Commission granted the variance. Couple hoops to jump through. That's all. And certainly one of my final lessons needs to be that natives take time. These are not instant gardens. Natives can often take several years just to start performing from germination if you use seed. They can take a number of years to establish. And even once they've become established, I talked previously about that kind of changing dynamic that they have, right? And so understand that the Monarda and the pale yellow coneflower that were dominant the first few years will not be dominant by year 8. And there is a longer term perspective that's needed. Restorationists, we often joke that our work is not appreciated for at least 20 or 30 years. And that's a hard time frame for people that are used to a very instant level of gratification, right? If it takes more than a portion of a second for your download, you're impatient. You have to have an entirely different mindset for working with native plants. So I thought what I would do now is check in with my hosts and see if we should call it an evening, and I will refer you to the individual plants. I do have some individual plants to highlight. Do you think we can take a few more minutes? What do you think? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So now I'm going to tell you, I teach a number of plant materials courses, plant identification, both in the classroom and in the field. And I cover several hundred woody species in our tree and shrub course, and I cover close to 1,000 species in our herbaceous materials course. So to just boil it down to these few was very hard, but I want to give you some plants that adapt. Here was my parameter: adapt well to the garden and maybe things you haven't seen or tried before. Actia Pacquipota, which is also known as white bainberry. And sometimes I've even heard it called doll's eyes. This is a beautiful plant. It has a pinnately compound leaf with this beautiful kind of serrated zigzag margin. And the flowers come up in the late summer, and they're these beautiful little white kind of short spikes. And then in the early autumn, those little spikes transition to these beautiful white berries with these red peduncles. Very unusual, and those are held up above the leaves of the plant. And it's a larger plant, a couple feet across and probably a good 3+ feet tall, but really beautiful for the shade. Something different, something late season, and so many of our woodland plants are early spring, right? Here's another one that is a late summer bloomer. If you've worked with columbine in your garden, good for you. There's really not a bad Aquilegia out there among the columbines. They're all marvelous and delightful. This is the native woodland one, Aquilegia canadensis. It is specifically this kind of bright red and yellow two-tone. And again, I love the texture of the foliage, slightly bluish tint to it, almost kind of fern-like in its delicacy. The overall plant is going to be a good 24 to 30+ inches tall. The mound of foliage at the base, and then the delicate little branches and flowers held up above the foliage, usually in July. Now, I will say this is very easy to save the seed from. Just watch for the little capsules to form, and as they're starting to look dry, grab them and put them in an envelope, because if you let them too long, they're going to pop and explode, and then all your seed is sown for you, maybe where you don't want it. Wild ginger, Asarum canadense. For all those of you who are frustrated at finding a ground cover for the shade that is not invasive, as many of the commercial ornamental ground covers are, winter creeper and vinca can be quite invasive. This is a native that you should look into. It does need mesic to moist soil, so it will not take dry, but as long as you have some good shade and some reasonably moist soils, It's really quite lovely. It has these heart-shaped leaves, and if we could see them more closely, they're slightly fuzzy. We call that hirsute. And this is what it looks like growing in the landscape. It's only going to be about 6+ inches tall. And you really don't see the flowers. The flowers are down along the ground. You'd have to part the leaves and look underneath, and the flowers are not particularly attractive. Those are designed to attract little ants. And here you see someone holding them. They're about the size of a thimble. So don't worry, you won't even notice them. You grow this for the foliage, and it's rhizomatous, so it spreads and fills in. Here's one of my favorite sedges. I won't roll up my sleeves. I even have this one tattooed. I love it so much. This is a Sedge Warrior in our shaded areas. It's a beautiful little grassy kind of tussock, probably only about maybe 6 to 9 inches tall. And here you see it spreading, and then all of a sudden it's going to spread and it's going to spread, and it's holding the ground. It has a beautiful fibrous root system that keeps things in place, and it plays well with all the other things that you would like to establish. This is an ultra close-up of where the leaves kind of merge with the crown, the growing crown, and there is a little bit of reddish to them. It's not a hugely spectacular plant, but it's a workhorse in your native shade garden. All right, Cimicifuga racemosa is called black cohouse or black bugbane, or sometimes fairy candle. This is another larger plant that blooms later in the summer. So early in the season, you get this kind of nice mass of again, very serrated, zigzaggy foliage. That's going to be a good 2 feet plus each direction. And then in the late summer, it'll shoot up these flower stalks that'll be a good 5+ feet tall. And they have this kind of candelabra effect. They bloom from the bottom up, so you can see that they open at the bottom, and those little florets just work their way all the way up the spike. Really quite lovely and graceful. They kind of swing above the foliage, and you see them there in the woods just looking spectacular. Claytonia Virginia, this is one of our spring ephemerals. We're very often familiar with those woodland wildflowers that come early in the spring. Again, when the canopy is more open, the leaves haven't fully emerged, and they bloom, and they're so charming. Here in this bottom picture, the turf has naturalized, and there's violets and dandelions and spring beauty all kind of peacefully coexisting. And it's really quite charming. It's only going to be about 4 or 5 inches tall. This is just kind of the natural range of color variation. So essentially white with a little bit of pinkish veining, almost grass-like. It's a little tiny bulb, and it naturalizes beautifully, but by the time the hot weather is coming at the end of May, beginning of June, it's starting to go dormant already. So it's a short cycle. Mix it in with your other things though. The same with this one, Dicentra Cucularia. This is Dutchman's breeches, and it's said to be named because the little flowers look like little pantaloons hanging on the clothesline. Some of the most beautiful foliage. I mean, even if the flowers weren't so unique, right, I would probably grow it just for that beautiful bluish, delicate foliage. You can see how finely incised or cut it is. This mass is going to be maybe 15 to 20 inches across, and the whole plant will probably only be about 14 to 18 inches tall. Again, an early spring bloomer in our woodlands that eventually will go dormant quite quickly with the heat of summer. Geranium Immaculatum, this one crosses into the savanna as well. It can take not only the shade of the woodland, but it can take quite a bit of sun out in the savanna, as long as the savanna, the sunnier conditions are not too dry. This is kind of a late spring, early summer bloomer. So it's later than the ephemerals, and it does not die back. You see this pretty foliage here, these kind of rounded leaves with these very deep sinuses kind of cut into it. Really charming. And I like pictures with hands or rulers or pen caps or things, because they give you scale, so you get a sense of how small these flowers are. But they're numerous. And again, this is almost kind of a rhizomatous plant that will spread and fill in the gaps. Very charming. Virginia Bluebells is another one of our spring ephemerals. And this too will die back completely. But oh my goodness, for the time that it's around, it's spectacular. It looks kind of like a soft leaf lettuce when it's first emerging, and the buds will be tightly closed and dark, almost purple. And then as they open, they become that blue, and as they senesce, they become pink. So, and this whole area, all the pale blue in here is Virginia bluebells. I'm going to say about 15 to 20 inches tall, spreading and filling an area over time. But again, by the heat of June, they will be gone. And you'll say, didn't I have bluebells here? You did, but they are a short, spectacular window. Phlox divaricata lanthamii is the woodland phlox. If you have grown garden phlox, it's going to have that same charming little flower, but just in this kind of lavender blue. It's a kind of loose, sprawling plant. You can mix it with other things. It's going to kind of lean on its neighbors. In drier, sunnier conditions in a savanna, this one could work as long as it wasn't too dry. It probably will start to die back by the heat of July, but it's really quite charming in that late spring time frame. I want to say it's going to be blooming end of April into May. May apple, Podophyllum peltatum, has these gorgeous, spectacular umbrella-like leaves. There's actually a Y branch. Each of the little umbrellas is partnered. And at the juncture of the Y, they have this one spectacular white flower, snow white. And that flower, once pollinated, gives you this beautiful little fruit that's probably about the size of a little key lime, if any of you have squeezed those for pie. And this too will spread and kind of colonize an area. Really beautiful, but again, early spring, end of March into April, maybe blooming by May, hence the name May apple, and forming fruit just before it senesces with the heat of, June. And another spring ephemeral bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. I'm always heartened to see this pushing up through the leaf duff. The flower will be rolled up in the leaf, almost like the leaf is enveloping it like a cloak. If we were to break the stem, you would find a red sap that does indeed work as a dye. And it's around for a few weeks and then it's gone. But how magical it is to see these flowers, again, just pure white, probably a good 2 inches across, and you can see how the leaf just kind of wraps around it. Really very charming. And I know goldenrods get a bad rap because they can be a bit of a garden thug, but this is a fun one. This is zigzag goldenrod, very shade tolerant. We don't often think of goldenrods as growing in the shade. And this is fall interest. And it's hard for us to find fall bloomers for the shade. This is a great one. I like the, again, kind of serrated, jagged edge of the leaves. I like the way the flowers are more concentrated spikes, but you can see this is a spreader. You know what you do with spreaders in your garden, don't you? You sharpen your D-handled cutting spade, and in the spring, if they're getting a bit beyond where you want them, you just give them a good sharp cut back. And that's all you need to do. But it really is nice for a bit of late season color. And again, height on this, I'm going to put at around 2 feet and spreading not aggressively, but maybe a little assertively. All right, I had to change this. This is one of those ones that used to be an aster and in the revised nomenclature is now Symphotrichum, right? Symphyotrichum, shortii. It used to be Aster shortii. And again, this is one of the woodland asters. And I like to have some things that still are blooming in September and October. This is that nice kind of pretty lavender bluish lavender. A little sprawly and loose, but very pleasant. And then my last woodland one is Thalictrum dioicum, the early meadow rue. And again, beautiful foliage, delicate, slightly bluish cast, very similar to the columbine. But then up above the mass of foliage will be these delicate little tassels. And so the foliage is probably only maybe a foot, foot and a half, but then held up above that another foot are these beautiful little tasseled flowers. Very, very charming. And those come along probably end of May, beginning of June. It does persist more, the foliage persists better than some of the ephemerals. All right, now some of those woodland things on your list that I said is available to you, they were starred so that you can know they do cross over to the savanna. But then I wanted to highlight a few savanna things that really do best in not full sun, not full shade, but kind of that lovely middle ground where you have partial shade or dappled light. This is Dodecathion media, the shooting star. This is a fairly conservative species when we're working with restoration, but when I plant it in my woodland garden, again, I have big high oak trees, it's just happy as can be. And this is often blooming in late May, maybe into the first week of June. And it's like this little burst of fireworks, right? Very charming. And from this basal rosette of foliage that again is kind of soft and lush, like almost like a leaf lettuce. These are the little seed capsules forming. So if you do want to collect the seed, again, I've had quite good germination from this. The only trick seems to be to just scatter it in a flat that you're going to leave out in the winter and let it stratify naturally. Polygonatum biflorum, this is Solomon seal. This could work in the woods as well, but I think it's really happiest with a little bit of dappled sunlight. It has a beautiful architecture, these arching stems with that kind of ladder-like look of the leaves, very structured. And this too is rhizominous and will form a nice colony. And then I would say mid to late May has these beautiful little hanging flowers from underneath the stem. So really very charming. The flowers fade, but the leaves persist through the growing season. So again, this one is not ephemeral. We all know brown-eyed Susan, right? Rudbeckia hirta, but there are some lovely other Rudbeckia species that do well in the partial shade. This one is Subtomentosa, which I'm not very good with common names. I have to look the common names up. I know the scientific ones. This is called sweet coneflower. I always called it Rudbeckia Subtomentosa. And it's bigger. It's a good 3 or 4 feet tall, but the flowers are kind of open and charming, and it handles that kind of partial shade really nicely. And a midsummer bloomer. I'm going to call this July, maybe into early August. And Rudbeckia triloba, which is a little more short and architectural, 3-leaved coneflower. Also, again, the problem with common names, often called brown-eyed Susan. But this one is more in that 2 to 3 foot height range, I want to say. And the stems have this pretty reddish kind of character. The flowers are tinier but numerous. So fun to play with some of the other Rudbeckias. This is false Solomon seal, Smilacina racemosa. Also the pretty architecture like we saw with the Solomon seal. You can see how the leaf structure is similar, but they're a little more compact, a little smaller. And instead of the flowers being underneath, they are at the tip of the stem as a little spray of blossoms that then forms berries by the fall. And then one grass for the partial shade. We often think of grasses as only working in the full sun. This one loves a bit of shade. This is Hystrix patula, or bottle brush grass. A delicate, maybe 4 to 5 feet tall, with the seed plumes in the late part of the season. And they're so delicate. You can see the little awns. They look spiky, but they're soft, more like stiff hairs. And it has this very graceful movement in the wind. Really beautiful. All right, and on to a few from the prairie. You guys know this one, right? Everybody should grow butterfly weed. It's one of the spectacular milkweeds. I have this one tattooed on me too. This is best in well-drained to dry soils. When people tell me they have not had success with this plant, it's because their soils are too damp or poorly drained or too heavy. So plant it where you have very good drainage and full sun. I guarantee you it will do just fine. The Baptisias, maybe as a gardener you've grown Baptisia Australis, which is the blue indigo. There are 2 natives, Baptisia leucantha and Baptisia leucophea, the white and the cream indigos. You really can use this as a shrub. This is a good 3 to 4 feet across and 3+ feet tall, and these spires come along at the end of May into June, and they're just spectacular. Then in the summer, those become seed pods, and those seed pods darken and dry black into the fall. And so Talk about a lot of mileage for interest. It's really stunning. And the bees love it. Even the foliage is pretty. It has a legume-like foliage with that kind of clover, three-leafed character, but a slight bluish tint to it. It's really pretty in the garden. But again, taproot, put it there and leave it alone and don't try and transplant it. How about Coreopsis Tryptrus? Coreopsis Tryptrus is called tall Coreopsis or tall tick seed. And that is a reference to the fact that there will be little seeds that form from these flower heads that have prongs and will stick into your clothing. But it is a loose, kind of sprawly 4 to 5 foot tall plant. And I think if you can appreciate it for what it is, it's a beautiful, soft, pale yellow, and really quite architecturally nice. Here you see it kind of growing in the garden. And I know you all know purple coneflower, but what about pale purple coneflower? Echinacea pallida. This one also, like the butterfly weed, prefers dry, well-drained soils. And it is a more delicate flower head. The petals are thinner and a little more open. But again, include that biodiversity in there. This is a July, August bloomer. How about rattlesnake master? Talk about a great architectural plant. It has leaves like a yucca plant, hence the species name, Yucca folium. And then in the midsummer, it sends up these flowers that look like kind of spiky little ping pong balls. And you see it and there's kind of no mistaking it. It has an almost silver white kind of cast in the landscape. And what I will tell you about the hydrology of this plant is it can handle very dry soils. It can also grow in seasonally saturated soils. So it tolerates almost any hydrology. Prairie smoke, one of the few early blooming plants in the prairie. Most of the prairie plants are taller and bloom later, but this one blooms early before the prairie has filled in. And it's a very delicate little plant. It's probably only about 15 inches tall, plus or minus. And you see the delicate little foliage here. And then the little pink flowers that come that kind of trail upside down. And when those flowers fade, the little wisps are like smoke. And it gives this beautiful texture of kind of pink smoke. And that will bloom probably beginning of May. And it'll be these little smoky drifts by early May. And then once we get the heat in June, then the warm season prairie things come on and this fades away. And I know you've all worked with blazing stars. I love them. There's not a single bad one. But what about the rough blazing star, Laetris aspera? A little less columnar in its flower form and its spike, more like individual little buttons. So it has a very different texture. Again, try some different species if you like a genus, and realize that all of the blazing stars are really spectacular for the pollinators and the butterflies. Again, kind of a mid to late summer bloomer, July into early August, and a little smaller than some of the other Laetris. I would put this one at maybe 30 inches or so. We talked about our bee balm, our Monarda. That's a workhorse of the garden. Remember, it is a mint. It is a spreader. It can be a little aggressive. Just take your spade and clip it back where you don't want it. Also, if you have a problem with this getting floppy, pinch it back until about the 4th of July, and then stop pinching and you'll have a bushier, fuller plant. And then if you stop pinching, then it'll go to flower in the late summer and do just fine. Phasostija Virginiana is the false dragon head or obedient plant. This will range from pale pink to a whitish color. And again, a strong architectural plant blooming in the mid to late summer, July until early August. It will spread in the garden, but not aggressively so, nicely so. It'll fill in. Pale-headed coneflower or gray coneflower. This one is tall, a good 4 to 5 feet, but I like the way the petals reflex back. And it's delicate enough that you can mix it in with other things. This will even handle a little bit of light shade in the savanna. And again, late summer for the bloom, July, August. And of course, the silphiums. Again, not a bad species within the genus. This one is rosinweed, has that beautiful architecture where each pair of leaves is turned 90 degrees from the past one. Sunflower-like flowers that are probably a good 3 inches across, and the plant overall is going to be a good 4 feet plus. So it's a more structural element, but worth finding a place for. And compass plant with those spectacular leaves that are going to align themselves north and south to maximize their exposure to the sun. It's going to be that mass of foliage at the bottom for most of the year. And then in August, September, it's going to shoot up the flower stalk a good 6 to 8 feet. Just spectacular. Again, look at that taproot. When I talk about something having a taproot, good grief, you're not going to transplant that. Put it where you want it and leave it alone. And again, a goldenrod that minds its manners. This one is rigid goldenrod, Solidago rigida, or stiff goldenrod. I love the scale of this for the home garden. It's going to be only about 18 to 24 inches tall. It has pretty little leaves in this kind of upright stem and nice little flower clusters late September into October. Doesn't spread aggressively, gets along with its neighbors. It's a very lovely goldenrod. And one of my favorites, Tradescantia ohiensis, the native spiderwort. This is kind of more a June, July bloomer, but super charming and very, very tough. I had a bed of this adjacent to the driveway at one of our previous homes, and somebody parked a truck on it for the weekend. And they pulled the truck away, and I went over and I fluffed it up, and it was just fine. So just very tough. And again, a huge tolerance of different hydrologies. And last but not least, among our forbs, which are the flowering plants or flowering broadleaf plants of the prairie, Zizia aptera, the heart-leafed meadow parsnip. This again is an early bloomer. It has a flower much like the flower of dill, an umbel, but I like it because it blooms early, but then in the fall, look what you get. You get another season of interest out of the beautiful fall color of Zizia. I think it's a really underrated garden plant. And then I just want to wrap up by showing you a few of the grasses that are intrinsic to the matrix, the structure of the prairie, but ones that are called lower profile grasses. They're not going to get so big and tall and dominant. This is side oats grama, Budalua curtipendula. And again, it has these beautiful little kind of oat-like seeds that kind of dangle off to the side. Doesn't get very big. Maximum height on this is going to be maybe 30 inches. Maybe 34 on a good day. Panicum virgatum is a little taller. This will get up near 5 feet, but it stays more clumped. And so here you can see it's used as an ornamental. There are a great number of ornamental cultivars developed of this. Look for the straight species from a local genotype. I love the billowy soft panicles that come at the end of the season, and those stay through the winter. It's one of my favorite grasses in the winter. Schizocarium Scoparium is little blue stem. This looks good every part of the year, early season, mid-season, late season. This is November, this is February, and it's only about 20 inches tall to your knee. Just beautiful and really, really quite charming. Mesic to drier soils though, doesn't tolerate the wet. And then prairie dropseed. This is one of the most delicate textures. You see the grass down here, how fine and delicate, and again, kind of arching and draping it is. And then in the late August, early September time, it sends up these delicate little panicles that have the most wonderful fragrance. We don't think of grass as being fragrant. This one is. And I like to include this along whatever walking path I take because I want to run my hands through it and get that little aromatherapy at the end of the day before I walk in the door. So I realize I've gone a bit over. It's hard to contain myself when I talk to other native plant people. It really is. But closing thoughts about natives is look for them everywhere. The one thing I am thrilled to see is that the landscape industry is increasingly embracing natives. This is a view of Lincoln Park, right? And it's full of native plants. There are just all kinds of wonderful little treasures that you can incorporate in your garden. And with that, I will close. That is my contact information. And just so you know, This is our campus farm market that we grow all our own produce for. This is a glimpse of our farm in back of our building. That is our outdoor teaching laboratory. We are a vibrant, dynamic, small little program. I always used to apologize for being small at about 160 to 170 students. I learned a couple of years ago we're the second largest horticulture program in the state. We graduate about 20 to 30 people a year, almost all of them employed on or before graduation. And it is my great joy to teach this next generation because they are so full of commitment to sustainability and organic practices. It's very reassuring. So, whew, I am done. What questions can I answer for you?
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Nancy wants to know, what are the native evergreen trees for our area?
That's an excellent question, and it's challenging because really and truly, there are not a lot of native evergreens for northeastern Illinois. Really, the only two that I would say are truly indigenous to our region are the white pine, Pinus strobus, and the eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana. So neither one is tolerant of burning. If you know you need an evergreen, place it judiciously, carefully in your landscape so that if you do get to burn some other zones of your garden, you're not going to put your evergreen at risk. Now, I will say, if you look just a little further west and north, you will pick up some additional evergreens that I think still do very well here. One is the Black Hills spruce, which is technically from South Dakota, Picea glauca densata. It's a lovely compact spruce. It doesn't get so ginormous like the blue and the Norway. And it's great for urban sites and very tough and quite drought tolerant. And then just a little further north, we will pick up some of the hemlock, right? And those are really nice if you can afford them. They're slow growing and they like a little bit of shade, but they're one of my favorite evergreens. We'll also pick up some of the other pines. One of the marvelous books, I wish I'm sitting in my library and I keep wanting to grab a book off. I'll send this to your folks there. There's a great book by Gary Haichu about native woody plants, and he gives all the geographic ranges, and it's a really marvelous book. It's out of print, but you can still find a copy here and there online. And that also will give you a great list of additional evergreens.
Great, great. We have a question from Paula. She asked if you could please repeat what goldenrod species are now, she said now to be avoided.
I think the main solidago that we're seeing a problem with is Solidago altissima, A-L-T-I-S-S-I-M-A, altissima. It's called oldfield goldenrod, and it's become very aggressive. There's been some kind of genetic shift in that plant where it's just really, really aggressive. Most of the other goldenrods are, you know, they're pioneer colonizers. They're going to be more tolerant of disturbed sites. So I tend to be fairly selective in the goldenrods that I include. I want ones that are not going to be garden thugs and kind of overtake an area. But the one to avoid is altissima.
Thank you. We have a question from Kathleen, and I think that I can help her with that one. She's received a couple of certificates of completion after the programs, but no one has mentioned what we redeem them for. That's because that's still up for grabs right now. We're still trying to determine how to handle that, and we'll let you all know as soon as we've decided. Now another one for you, Rory, from Rebecca. Are there any plants to look out for when you're planting in a yard with pets?
I think, again, animals have good sense, right? Generally, if your cat or your dog goes out in the yard and starts to eat some grass, it's generally because they want something that's going to irritate their stomach because something's irritating them and they want to get it out. And you know, as humans, we have trouble with that. It's like, oh my God, the dog ate something that made it throw up. And it's like, yep, that's because it knew it needed to do that. There are a couple things that I would be concerned about. Monkshood, Aconitum napellus is one of them, pretty toxic. And I wouldn't grow castor bean, ricinus, you know, the tropical plant that we use as an annual that's processed to make the toxin ricin as a powder. So there's a couple things that I would avoid that just, even if the animal were to get a hold and chew up a leaf or a stem, would probably make them pretty badly ill. Those two come to mind. So monkshood and castor bean.
Thanks, Rory. Hey, Roland was wondering, what habitat do native shrubs fit in?
Oh, there's a native shrub for every niche. So I focused on herbaceous things today, but we could do another whole session just on woody plants that are natives. I will say that there is a great handout out there, and I want to say it was a partnership between Chicago Wilderness and the Morton Arboretum and a couple other good organizations that gives you native shrub alternatives. So I talked at the beginning of the program how sometimes the ornamental horticulture industry is still promoting certain woody plants that we know are invasive: Japanese barberry, burning bush, the honeysuckles. You don't want to plant those. There are better native alternatives, and there's a marvelous handout. Again, I'm taking notes, and I'll send that link for that native shrub habitat. But
We actually have that handout.
oh, great.
Yeah, thanks.
That's a good one. And I would say, you know, just as we could have talked about many more plants, we could have added some woody things into these conversations too. There's native shrubs for the woodland. There's gooseberries and raspberries and things. So it just depends what you're looking for. And then there's certain viburnums that are native that do very well in that shady kind of zone. There's even shrubs that we could incorporate kind of with some of the drier prairie things, the hypericums and the duravillas that are durable and native and would handle that as well.
Thank you. Nancy's wondering, she'd like your thoughts about using native cultivars.
That's a good question. There was just a marvelous article not too long ago in the Fine Gardening magazine about nativars, right? So when we take a native plant and create a cultivated variety. So the good news is that those cultivars of natives do a better job than sterile ornamental varieties in terms of providing pollinator benefits, but not as good as a species. So you have to ask yourself, what is the trait that's appealing to you about that cultivar? Is it a bigger flower? Is it a flower that's a different color? What advantage does that cultivar bring to you? I would say as long as you don't get into the double or triple flower frills, you're still going to have decent pollinator value. So the single open flowers where you can see the stamen and the pistil and the business parts of the flower that are the attractors for the pollinator, those tend to do better. So if you're making an assessment about a cultivar, that would kind of be one of my gauges. Is it a big frill, double, triple, you know, lots and lots of petals so that I lose that benefit of attracting the pollinators? They're not inherently bad, but I'm going to assess if they're really necessary.
Thank you. Sandy said, you mentioned black walnut. Are there different genuses? One hangs over my small yard. Is there a sedge that will work under it? The Carex pennsylvanica, maybe?
Maybe. That's a great question. So there's a number of species of juglans, which is the genus of black walnut. Black walnut specifically is Juglans nigra, and it has one of the higher toxicities among any of the allelopathic plants that we know about. Allelopathy is when a plant exudes something from the root system that changes the soil chemistry and makes it inhospitable for other plants to grow there. So black walnut in particular exudes a chemical called juglone, and it eliminates a lot of things. I have found that, believe it or not, daylilies seem to do okay with it. And I would say if there was one really super tough thing that you could try, it would be pen sedge. I think it would be worth trying. What I generally find is I might have to not have anything in that first kind of 3 to 5 feet up near the trunk. And then as I get out toward closer to the drip line of the tree, the roots thin out a little bit. I get to the thinner, finer feeder roots. And so I get a little less toxicity, and then I can get some things established, but it's hard. Also prune up the lower branches so that there's light penetration, because walnuts also tend to have a very dense shade.
Thank you. One from Jim. He loves spring beauties, but can't find the plants in native plant sales. He's found bare root plants from Prairie Moon, but they don't always have them. Where can I find these plants to buy?
Boy, that's a great question. So what you have to remember with a lot of those spring ephemerals is they're actually very tiny little bulbs. And the only way that we can really kind of propagate those is to grow them on in a field setting where they have those right mycorrhizal and organic matter associations, and then sustained division, right? Where you dig up a batch of them and you take some of them and you propagate those, and then you put some back in place to grow again for a few years down the road. That's why supply is often quite limited, because a lot of those spring ephemerals don't respond well to traditional nursery propagation methods. They need to grow in those organic, slightly acidic oak woodland soils, and they're slightly acidic from the natural tannic acids of the oaks as they decompose, right? That's why some years they have them and some years they don't. I would say when you see them, go ahead and get those bare root plants. And then my recommendation is to gather up a big tarp full of oak leaves and shred them. I will tell you my tip for doing this. I have a metal trash can. I put about 15 to 18 inches of leaves into it. And then I take my string trimmer and I use it like one of those Braun immersion blenders, and I just shred the leaves up in the bottom of the can. And then they're nice, when they're nice and fine, I prepare my planting bed and I work those into the top of the soil. And then I put those nice bulbs in and things, and that's, I'm kind of like helping them out. And I know I said don't amend, but I'm using only that oak leaf litter that they would naturally have, and then leave them undisturbed. See what happens.
Rory, Emily wonders if you recommend starting spring ephemerals like spring beauties and Dutchman's breeches from seed.
Again, my experience has been that the germination is very limited. So we talk about germination rates as growers, you know, things that have higher germination rates, 75 to 95%, very easy for us to collect the seed, scatter that into a seed flat, scatter that directly into the ground. So things like columbine or some of the other things I mentioned where you can grab those seeds and scatter them out, perfect. The spring ephemerals don't always produce seed, first of all. And then secondly, when they do produce it, germination rates tend to be quite low, often below 20%. So, you maybe want to try a little, again, a little extra TLC. If you have a way to collect the seed, gather that seed, let it sit in a flat during the rest of the summer. And then as the winter's coming on, slide that into a plastic bag and stick it in the lower drawer of your refrigerator, right, with some moist sand or something in a bag, stratify it, and then put it into a seeding flat in the spring and see how you do. But be prepared that germination will be quite low. If you get 10 or 15%, you're doing fantastic.
Roland asks, how do you identify the Solidago altissima?
It's got a narrow leaf, but do I have a picture of that? I'm looking at the books. It has a leaf that's probably about the size of your index finger that is relatively narrow but flares kind of toward the tip. If you look in a good field guide and compare that one, you'll see. And then the leaves are kind of almost whorled around the stem. So it has this pretty specific architecture. And then in the fall, once it does start blooming, it has a kind of triangular flower. So that's also pretty easy to identify. When you get good at it, you'll be able to identify those little kind of, the stems are slightly hairy when they first emerge in the spring. You'll be able to identify it when it's still small, and that's when you can get in and pull it out. But with a good field guide and a little practice, it is something you can train yourself to recognize pretty easily.
Great, thanks, Rory. We've got a few more. Emily was wondering, do you have any tips for keeping rabbits from eating newly planted plugs before they're established?
Chicken wire. I mean, I know it looks awful, but you have to give those little plants time to really kind of settle in, develop their root system, and take hold. So I just create some baskets of, I actually like hardware cloth a little better than chicken wire. Hardware cloth is that stuff that has about 1 square centimeter openings. And I literally I cut a circle, I make a slit, and I make kind of a cone. And I put it over that and just hold it down with a couple landscape staples. And, you know, once it's had a good month or so to settle in and it's starting to show top growth because the roots have established, then I feel like I can remove that, and hopefully it will have enough oomph to resist the rabbit browse.
Mm.
You can also have your dog kind of pee in the area. I know that's not a very delicate way to put it, but it does help.
Julie's wondering something related. Any suggestions about deer eating everything?
Oh, I am actually contemplating how much of our 7 acres we can afford to fence with fine wire, 6-foot deer mesh kind of fencing, because I really want to start adding more fruit trees in an area of the property that's open. And I know it will just be throwing money away unless I do something to protect the area from deer. That is a really tough one. I will say, certainly when I worked at the Morton Arboretum, one of the strategies was to use soap. Are you familiar with this technique? Those little tiny stinky motel bars, you know, the ones that are like really, really strong, like Cashmere Bouquet and Irish Spring, and like anything that's a really stinky soap. We used to drill holes in the soap and hang them on strings on the perimeter branches of your shrubs, and the deer do not like that. And even the other thing I've used, and again, it's not very aesthetic, those little tiny aluminum pie pans, the little tiny midi pies, you know, like when you see those 50-cent Walmart pies. I don't want the pies, I want the pans. You can buy them in the store. And again, punch a hole in and hang those on, and they move around in the breeze and they flash, and that is very disconcerting to them. So neither is toxic, neither is foolproof, but it will help a bit.
Thank you. Karen asks, what about nativars that don't reseed? Do they have nectar?
Again, we go back to that distinction of, does it have a single open flower where you can see that it has those necessary reproductive parts, right? Flowers are reproductive organs of the plant. And the parts that are doing the work are the stamen, right? And the pistil. The pistil is the female section with the sticky stigma and the little tube that's the style down to the ovary. And the stamen is the little anther and filament part that's releasing the pollen. That's the part that's doing the work of the flower. And as long as those are kind of prominent and visible in that native cultivar, usually they still have pretty decent pollinator benefits. But when you start seeing those double, triple flowering types, you lose that. And very often those flower developments in cultivars tend to even be sterile. So when you get into the sterile part, they've lost the mechanics of the flower that matter. So I don't know that they will have nectar because there's no reason for them to attract pollinators if they're sterile.
Both Mary and Kathy both asked, what do you mean by stratify?
Oh, excellent. Introduction to horticulture concept, absolutely. So seeds that are produced on plants that are adapted to having a winter need to go through a cold, moist treatment to trigger the germination process. So if you collect a lot of native seeds in the fall and expect to be able to grow them, they won't germinate for you. They need to go through a stratification period, a cold, moist treatment. And there's actually reference books that tell you by species what needs to be stratified for how long. So for example, I know if I'm growing prairie dropseed, I actually don't need to stratify that one. But if I'm growing big blue stem, I need to stratify for at least 10 to 12 weeks. And that's very simple. I can do it outside, depends what I have access to, right? I can take, I have some shallow old wooden boxes. I think they were Coca-Cola trays from when the Coca-Cola used to come in those little thick bottles. I got them at a flea market, and I fill them with regular soil, not potting soil, just regular soil. And I work that into the top, and then I tuck them under my porch. and then they stratify naturally. But you can also do this in your refrigerator. You can take a Ziploc bag, you can make some sand nice and moist, right? And then you can mix your seed in, put it into the Ziploc bag, seal it, label it, and put it in your fridge for the specified period of time. Then when you take it out, right, it's gone through what that little seed perceives as winter, and it will be ready for germination. Most native things in this region need some type of stratification. Okay, good question.
Thanks so much, Rory. Guess what? You've answered all their questions. I wish you could see some of the chats because some of the comments were, well, all the comments were fabulous, but people loved this.
Oh, good, good.
Well, you have such a beautifully artistic way of describing not only the processes, but also the plants themselves. This has just been wonderful.
Well,
You
good.
well,
I like to say I'm a plant junkie, and there is nothing more exciting than getting to share your addiction with a bunch of other junkies, right? So when I speak about these plants, I really want to say there's a reverence there, there's a delight there, and I think that's what's so endlessly fascinating about this is no matter how much I have learned, there is always more to learn. And it's always just so lovely to share it with folks like yourself who are wanting to go out and plant more native plants. So thank you for being interested in this.
Yeah, thanks again. You said in the beginning you knew you were preaching to the choir. Well, I'll tell you, we're singing.
Good. Good. Go out and spread the gospel now.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. I hope that the sun is shining tomorrow. Stay well and safe. Good night.
Good night.